Now, you have rental property yourself. What are some things that you'd recommend to a landlord? Let's say they're walking into a space, they just finished watching HGTV for 17 hours, and they're like, "Oh, I'm going to pull out some walls. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that." I mean, is there any kind of like common mistakes or issues that you think your average DIY landlord might fall into?
Yeah, they probably didn't hire an architect.
2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. You got Steve and I here in the Rent Prep office, but we got a guest here with us today. I want to welcome Mike Anderson from Abstract Architecture here. How you doing, Mike?
Good. Hi, guys. Great to be with you.
So the reason we got Mike in the office today is I've known Mike from a past job, and he's a fun guy. He's definitely knowledgeable, and we actually happen to be talking on that job about what to do with properties as far as making them more accessible for the elderly. We had a client that we were working together with, and happened to get an email, and that came in from Ryan, and he was asking these questions specifically about, he's got these renters that he really likes. They're a little bit older, and he wants to keep them, and he's kind of concerned about what kind of improvements he can make to the rental property. And I figured, why not have Mike into the office and get his take on it? So before we get into that, well, how about a little bit of backstory? Because Mike, I mean, I don't know a lot of people, but you got some of the most interesting backstory of anybody I know. Give us a little bit of a rundown, like where you're from. People might pick up that you have an accent, so we can start there.
Well, the accent's pretty much gone these days, but I'm originally from New Zealand. I came to the States in the early 90s, and I've been living in Buffalo since mid to late 90s ever since. Never left, and probably not going anywhere after this.
Yeah. And now I know some of our listeners, it comes up once in a while, or maybe the Landlord Water Cooler book cover, they saw that I'm a taller fellow. But Mike, you're a pretty big guy. 6'8", maybe?
6'8.5". I like to push in that half because, for those people who are just 6'8", I got a half inch on them.
And then you also played professional rugby as well before becoming an architect?
Yeah, you grow up in New Zealand, you play two sports, rugby in the winter, cricket in the summer. I moved my way over to playing professionally in Europe and got interested in American football, got into that, went to college on a football scholarship, got into architecture.
Were you a kicker?
I wish. I'd probably still be playing. No, unfortunately. Big old hog on the defensive line, unfortunately.
It'd be a waste if you were a kicker. It'd be ridiculous. I shook Mike's hand when he first came in. I was like, oh my God. It was like shaking a bear's hand. It was like the biggest paw ever.
You've seen some bears.
Thank you.
You've seen some bears, right?
Seen some bears. Yeah. So what's more hardcore, New Zealand rugby or American football?
You know what? They're two completely different games, but football is a lot more violent. It's a lot faster. We don't have helmets and pads in rugby. Mm-hmm. You hit a little bit differently because of that. Football, probably be lynched when I go home next, but I would say football's the tougher of the two.
Wow. All right. So what in New Zealand rugby, I know that there's you're going to kill me for saying this probably, there's a dance.
The hucker.
The hucker.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
Oh, is it like the whole?
Yeah. It's pretty awesome. All right. So did you used to do that? Is that like a New Zealand wide thing, or is that specifically for the?
At the schoolboy level, it's more of a private prep school kind of thing. Once you're playing representative rugby, it's pretty much standard. Mm-hmm. When you're playing like an everyday Saturday game of club rugby, it's blow the whistle and get the game going kind of thing.
Right. You're a jerk if you do it in that situation.
I don't even think that would allow you. Like the other side would kick off and the game would start.
The one time, because I love that. I love the hucker. The one time that I thought it got a really, really bad rap. I don't know if you guys remember this in the Olympics. I think it was the New Zealand Olympic basketball team did it on the court to the American team, and then the Americans
like an intimidation kind of thing.
Yeah, and then the Americans like kicked their ass like 130 or something crazy. It was something ridiculous. I was like,
I think it's like everything. There's a certain level where, all right, do you really need to be doing this?
Right.
When it's international rugby teams, I'm all for it.
Right.
If it's in that situation, they deserved everything.
Yeah. The basketball team was like, I don't know if that's really going to intimidate these guys. Like the best, basketball athletes in the
world. It's one of those things where you realize you didn't have a shot in hell.
Yeah,
so
maybe.
you might as well just
go out.
Maybe this does some weird psychological thing, and LeBron can't dribble a ball.
It does work. I remember one high school tour to Italy. We did it against a very good Italian club side. we had like three scores on them before they even knew what was happening. They were shell shocked.
Right.
So there is a psychological warfare to it.
Right. I could see it.
Pretty much these days, every Polynesian-based culture has something similar, and it has become a little bit stagnant. But that is the New Zealand All Blacks are the team that have been doing it for the longest internationally.
Right. Yeah, I got to imagine you go to an Italian team, if you're facing off against an Italian team, maybe they've never seen it before.
Exactly.
There's no internet then. They're like, holy cow, what is this? Like, you're just blown away. Like, oh, no. Yeah, what did I get into?
I think more than anything, it's one of those things where it pumps you up. Too.
Yeah.
You're pounding on your chest and you get fired up and you it's more psych up than it.
Right.
But no, back to the original question. There was something about football that was just intoxicating for me. I'd never put a helmet on and run into somebody at full speed before, and that was like, damn, this is awesome.
Except for the guy who's getting run into you at full speed.
Probably not
awesome.
Fault.
Yeah.
But again, like two different games.
Yeah. All right. So, how did you get into architecture? Obviously, you went to school for that.
Yeah, I was always interested in the built environment. I just never realized it. When you're a collegiate athlete, you got to have a certain percentage of your degree completed at each year. And I actually really had no intention of going to college. I was having fun just being a guy, and my guidance counselor threw out the simple question, well, what's your major going to be? And I was like, I don't know. Let's do architecture.
Right.
But again,
Pick something easy.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. We said no, but it's a long story to that too. Over the next couple years as I matriculated through college, and as part of that process, I transferred to UB, which at the time had a very progressive architecture school. And has developed even further now to be a very good architecture school. Mm-hmm. It was a decision that I realized was right. It was just an instinct decision, and it's definitely a profession where you have a good mix of creativity but practicality as well.
Right.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to the original question here.
Sure.
I feel like this won't be as exciting as everything else we just talked about.
I know.
But
let's try.
Grab handles.
Let's try.
How can we make grab handles real sexy?
Yeah.
Well, okay. Let's try a little harder.
So we got this email from Ryan, and Ryan's concern is he's got these ranch-style units that really serve the elderly well, so they don't have to worry about the stairs. But some of them are getting up in age, and he said he's got some great tenants, and he really likes them because they don't deal with the regular maintenance items that he deals with other tenants. But he's asking about like what kind of modifications that he should be looking at if you're trying to appeal to an older generation with your rental property. So if you were to walk into a property and it was just a normal property, what are the things that you're looking at? Like if you're kind of looking around the room in the different areas that you think you might upgrade or do to help somebody who's older?
Well, he's already hitting on some of the critical items. Obviously, you've got some spaces that are a little bit more difficult to maneuver as you get older, and that's those are primarily focused in the bathroom. Grab bars and the mounting of grab bars are fantastic. Aging in place asset. Moving beyond those into other spaces within any, whether it's your own residence or a rental, you should think about movement through the space. Are the doors wide enough? It doesn't have to be a person in a wheelchair, but a wider door is just easier to get through. Obviously, he did say that they were a ranch-style house. Without having a lot of stairs to maneuver around, that's an advantage. So those are the kind of things we look at. Can I stand at the front door? Can I maneuver through the house easily? Kitchen. Is it open plan or is it shut off to a little corner? Are the rooms of a certain
is having
size?
it kind of shut off? Is that a little bit better, or is having?
No. Again, your traditional older home in Buffalo is very compartmentalized. Every time I have to go from a room to a room, I have to, if I have a wall in front of me, I just can't walk right through it. I got to go around.
I don't believe
go
that.
To the door. I may have to operate a door. I may have to operate a pocket door, which is even worse than a swing door. If my house is built in the 80s and, early 80s, early 90s, and it's a single-story ranch with a large kitchen, dining, living room area. And I can stand in the kitchen and see the far end of the living room, and it's open plan. I have a much more easier time maneuvering around that than if I'm going from room to room or, through a small passageway into another room. So
What about the flooring? I mean, do you take a look at like kind of changes and transitions from different types of flooring?
Yeah, you don't want to have, yes, is the easy answer. Again, your older traditional home typically had a hardwood floor. It's got its pluses and its minuses. There's very little, you spill water on it. It's slippery. It's very, very smooth, very, very hazardous. But there's not a lot of transitions, which are elevation changes between surfaces. So that's advantage. If you have, if you go from a vinyl tile up to a carpet and it's got a thick pad, you instinctively have a tripping hazard there. So you want those elevation changes, particularly if they're in that, half inch to 1 inch range. You want them to be as minimal as possible. Older people, they don't lift their feet as high. So if they're, or if they have a hip or knee injury, they may be dragging their feet. So if I have something that can catch them, that's dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Going back to the bathroom, any recommendations on a tub?
So, yeah, again, obviously, if a person is getting older, they're not going to be able to get into a big, deep tub very often or very easily. Most rentals that we see or even most regular homes we see have the shower bathtub combo unit, which is typically more shower than bathtub. It's got a very shallow bathtub. That's a better accommodation than a very deep bathtub, unless you can have a separate bathtub and a shower.
Mm-hmm.
But so you look for that. How easy can someone with bad knees or short movement manipulate a space to get into?
Okay. So I think that kind of covers as far as kind of trying to future-proof your rental, and that could also be your home. I mean, if you have a parent or yourself, some things to think about as far as kind of future-proofing your residence. But now you have rental property yourself. What are some things that you'd recommend to a landlord? Let's say they're walking into a space, they just finished watching HGTV for 17 hours, and they're like, "Oh, I'm going to pull out some walls. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that." I mean, is there any kind of like common mistakes or issues that you think your average DIY landlord might fall into?
Yeah, they probably didn't hire an architect. The biggest mistake we see, and again, we typically come in after that first attempt to try and fix something, is that they didn't quite understand what they were getting into.
I'd say that's pretty accurate usually. Like,
yeah, well, I think
sounds like my whole thing too. Like, I didn't realize it was going to be this hard. Oh no.
Yeah, well, I think that's the whole sales point of the DIY market, is that you can do it yourself and you don't have to contact a professional. A lot of the times you can do it yourself, but it's always good to go and ask somebody, "Hey, I'm going to knock down this wall. Do you see any issues?" Buffalo traditionally has a very good building stock. Especially some of the older buildings are very well built. You can remove a wall here and there. Some of them you kind of got to put some other stuff back in. What we typically see is just people who, have a great idea or have an idea and start down a road to do it and don't realize what they've got themselves into.
Yeah. Now, you said the Buffalo has a good building stock. I mean, is there any kind of like giveaways or tells for certain areas of the country, or just type of building supply that you're like, oh, that might be an issue if you're trying to take a wall out? Or
again, obviously my practice is focused on the East Coast, particularly, our local market. We have an older traditional building stock, older lumber, which is typically stronger, first cut lumbers. So you can.
What do you mean by first cut?
So a lot of the older homes in Buffalo, the wood that was used to make those was actually cut down when it was a tree. That tree had that tree wasn't cultivated to be lumber.
Mhm.
It was a
specifically.
tree.
Right.
It's typically, when you go into a house and you see an actual size lumber piece where, my 2x10 is actually 2 inches by 10 and it's hardwood. That tree's probably, grown for 100 years before it got cut down to be used for that house. That wood is stronger than the same size piece of lumber that grew for 20 years.
Okay.
Sure.
So, again,
So that's maybe an advantage as far as like buying in an older home. I mean, if you had to guess, what would be the year where that transition really started to change, where it stopped being first cut wood? I mean, I know that's kind of a pretty specific question.
No, you know what? It's 50s and 60s.
Okay.
You'll find some houses from, post-war houses that are still original, actual size lumber.
Do you have a decade that you specifically don't like? I mean, it could be your own personal
late 80s,
taste.
early 90s.
Yeah. Why is that?
There was a massive building boom. We had a population shift, and houses were built very quickly at that point in time. And if I can knock up a house in a couple of weeks, it's probably not built very well.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I got a question for you on wheelchair ramps.
Mhm.
So a lot of times I see wheelchair ramps put onto a house. I know some landlords, we've had landlords that reached out to us, asked us about wheelchair ramps. How elaborate do they have to be? How much money do they cost? The one thing that I've noticed is there seems to be two very different styles of wheelchair ramps. One is sort of the probably the DIY, the do-it-yourself guy made it out of treated lumber and it looks kind of like a deck. And then I've seen these that almost look prefabricated, like out of metal, aluminum. Do you have any idea, is there like a prefabricated wheelchair ramp, and or is that something that they piece together? Or
typically it's pieced together.
Okay.
Again, if every house was 2 feet above grade, it would be very easy for a mass production of ramps that alleviated 2 feet of elevation change. Most of the metal ramps you see are yes, they're pre-manufactured, but they're like quasi custom. I can call up a ramp manufacturer and say, hey, I need a ramp that gives me 32 inches of elevation change. And the guy goes, here, well, we've got 3 sections that will meet it. You did hit on one thing. There are 2 types you see out there. There's the wood framed deck looking ramp that's being tacked on to the front of a house. And then there's the metal ramp. Again,
I'm not sure which one looks better either. I don't know.
Personally, I don't think either of them look good.
It's not great for curb appeal, but it's
But again, it's functionality more than anything. The things you look for, and if so, again, a lot of this is budget driven. I can spend a small fortune on a very nice ramp that has curb appeal, looks like it's being designed, isn't just a wood ramp sticking out from the front of my house. I may not have that in my budget. So you look at function, because after all, this has to serve a purpose. The metal ramps typically come with a grippy surface, even if that is as simple as an adhesive sandpaper like surface that goes down on top of it. So even in your Buffalo winter, it gives you some sort of level of safety in terms of using that ramp. Your wood ramp, whether it's got like the wood decking or a plywood with a similar adhesive surface on it, it is always going to, in my opinion, just fall a little bit less accessible.
Okay.
So I know a lot of landlords have this concern, like, okay, what am I legally responsible to provide? And I know that the ACA, Fair Housing, they always say reasonable accommodation. They use that word reasonable. So grab handles seem pretty reasonable.
Correct.
A $3,000 or $4,000 prefabricated aluminum ramp, probably not in the reasonable range, right? So if you have a rental, if you have somebody that says, hey, I'm going to need a wheelchair ramp, what do you do in that situation?
Again, I think much like, was it Ryan, our email person, you evaluate, I hate to say it, is this a good tenant? Is this a tenant I want to keep around?
Sure.
And this is a market where you want good tenants and you should go above and beyond to make them happy. And some accommodations don't cost a lot. Technically speaking, you really, you don't have to provide anything. The person is renting from you. If the house isn't accessible and it doesn't really meet their needs anymore, that they have, two options: either accommodate it and stay in the house, or look for something else. And again, this is my understanding of the law. The owner isn't beholden to any legal doctrine that says, all right, this person needs a ramp, you have to provide it. The issue becomes, once you do provide a ramp, it has to meet certain requirements. I can't just slap a piece of wood up on the side of the house and say, well, there's your ramp.
Right.
It has to be certain
grade,
it's got a maximum
probably.
slope. It has to, and again, if every time that person uses it, they fall over and slide down the thing, obviously the landlord would be liable. So it's not so much what you have to provide as once you provide it, it has to meet a certain level.
Right.
Okay. So this may be a question maybe for a building inspector, and forgive me if this is a little bit kind of obscure, but let's say you're looking at a property. I mean, because you own your property that you're at right now, and you also own your property where your business is at.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you're going to look at a property structurally, without getting really into the nuts and bolts, because our listeners aren't going to have the knowledge that you have, what are the things you're looking for? Are there red flags or certain things that you're really trying to observe? I mean, what do you got your eye on?
Again, it's easy stuff too. I'm looking for. You go down the basement, you look for cracks in the foundation wall, you look for rotten framing. There's, you can find them on every street. There's those houses in Buffalo that have like the foundations up to grade, and then it's all wood framing, and the wood frame's got like a 30-degree angle on it. That's a fix that you're going to have to deal with it. If you want to take it to the next level, you start to look around and see if people have done, DIY renovations, particularly plumbing and electrical. If they've started to cut holes in or cut big gashes out of floor framing to accommodate a pipe, you're going to have problems down the road.
Right.
Those kind of things. I'm more concerned about finding a good quality house than is a good place.
Right.
You got any more questions, Steve?
No. Super interesting. I think it's interesting to hear from the mind of an architect.
Dangerous.
What landlords might come across in being a landlord yourself and having a rental property. Are you a perfectionist in that way? Everything's got to be just right in that rental property? Are you cool?
That's an offshoot of being an architect, not a landlord.
Right.
You get into architecture because the built environment is interesting to you. You want to play around with it. You want to manipulate it. You don't want it to be an ugly space.
Right. Makes sense. And you got to love Buffalo, right, for the architecture.
We have some great history.
Yeah.
There's some beautiful houses here, and it's not just the big handful that get all the public attention in the press. There's a very very vibrant, strong, built history in Buffalo.
Sure. Yeah, very
We had a
interesting.
lot of money here at one point in time.
I agree. Yeah, that's just you go down Delaware and there's mansion after mansion after mansion. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, very cool. Cool stuff.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being on the podcast. Thanks for joining us in the office. And maybe we'll pick your brain again in the future.
Completely my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks, Mike.